She was appointed as the director of the Office of Civil Military Cooperation at the U.S. Agency for International Development by President Obama in 2012. And in that capacity, she is responsible for managing the relationship between USAID and the U.S. Department of Defense. Prior to coming to USAID, she has more than 30 years of experience in government and non-governmental sector working on stabilization and peacekeeping operations, arms control, non-proliferation, and civil military relations. She has held several senior positions at USIP, including Dean of Institutional Affairs in USIP's Academy, Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and a Senior Program Officer in the former Peace and Stability Operations Division. She also co-chaired the USIP Working Group on Civil Military Relations in Non-Permissive Environments, which developed the guiding principles for stabilization and reconstruction, which is part of what she's going to talk about today, so I won't say more about that. And she is, in addition to all of that, before getting to USIA and USIP, she did a variety of different things, including being director of the Congressional Roundtable on Post-Cold War Relations in the U.S. Congress. She was a senior fellow at George Mason University's Program on Peacekeeping Policy. She is the co-author of Rand's study, The Beginner's Guide to Nation Building, which was published in 2007, as well as a range of other special reports for USIP and beyond on topics related to civilian stabilization and capacity building. We are very fortunate to have her here today, and I think the title of her talk I am not sure about because I forgot to look at that before I got here.
Oh, don't worry. Something about world disorder and what to do about it.
That's right, how to solve all of the problems that we have in the world today.
Yeah, exactly.
Very quickly. So I'm very happy to invite you to join us, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Great, thank you. So I want to thank Renee, who actually forgot that she knew me 15 years ago. I've changed a little bit, my name, my hair, I guess. And also to William Banks, who's graciously have asked me to come up here. It took me 2 years to get here, and there was a very persistent student who kept at it, and I'm very glad that he persisted. My son went here for 2 years, and so I feel quite at home. On top of that, I'm very grateful that you've gotten me out of Washington. As you can imagine, what we often call the op-tempo. The op-tempo in Washington, D.C. right now is really off the charts. I had occasion to be with the former Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Defense, Michelle Flournoy, who some of you might have heard of. She was rumored to be first female Secretary of Defense and might get there still. And I talked to her about a month ago, and we were talking about the pace in Washington. And just 2 years ago, when she was at the Department of Defense, she would, we might have what we would call Principals Committee, where all of the heads of the departments, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, would get together to talk about some problem in the world. Now we have those almost on a daily basis. The other thing that we are having with frequency, lots of frequency, are NSC, National Security Council meetings that are chaired by the President of the United States. And indeed, there is one in a couple of hours on Ebola. There'll be another one on Friday on the situation in Iraq and Syria. So you can just garner from the calendar and from the schedule that there are many crises, they're very complex, and they require all of the pieces and arms of government to work together. Now, I just wanted to take us just a teeny bit through looking back to go forward, if that's okay with you. Because I think it's really important to remind ourselves of where we've been and how much we've achieved. There's a momentous event on November 9th, 1989. Does anybody know what that was? Right, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Renee and I and other people had been working and toiling on arms control and disarmament, and many others were working on the nuclear weapons, the building side of the nuclear weapons enterprise for many, many years. So when the wall fell and we turned around and we looked and saw what we had, It was a very different toolkit than what we had today. Indeed, we had huge forces that were conventional military forces that were arrayed in Germany and in other places. We had proxy wars, and we were supporting others to fight proxy wars. We had a nuclear establishment that had grown over many decades, including programs at major universities across the United States. We had grown physicists and arms control experts. We had built nuclear weapons labs. The whole industry had grown up over a couple of decades. And so then the wall fell. And we asked ourselves, okay, now what? Maybe we'll have a peace dividend. Maybe we can focus on issues in the United States that have been troubling us. But that was not the case. In rapid succession, we had wars break out in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, in East Timor, in Bosnia, in the heart of Europe, in Kosovo, and really on the order of every 18 months, we found ourselves conducting what for the United States and many others was a completely new and complex mission. Either you want to call it stabilization or peacekeeping or peace operations. There's many names for it. But what do we have? We had that military toolkit. We had diplomats that were seasoned in working very much in the midst of a Cold War. And we found ourselves instead dealing with not even state-on-state conflict, but intrastate conflict, where people were fighting inside of states. And we just didn't have the tools to deal with that. Can anybody just tell me one tool that we had to deal with societies that were in conflict in the world? I'll give you, they wear blue. Yeah, so we had UN peacekeepers, right? Not enough of them, but we had UN peacekeepers. The UN Security Council would make decisions to send those peacekeepers into places. There were two kinds of authorities for those peacekeepers, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 meant they could go in and enforce a ceasefire, which is mainly what we did then. And Chapter 7 meant they could actually do something. They had powers to protect the population, to deal with threats to security, and in some cases to arrest and detain, and that grew over time. Now in the world, there's probably not a Chapter 6 mission that would be constituted today. There would all be Chapter 7. But nevertheless, we found ourselves at that time with a new mission set, and we didn't have the tools. So if you think about it, right, 2 decades ago, it took us decades to build the nuclear weapons arms control field to the point where we actually were able to have some successful arms control agreements and keep the United States and the Soviet Union from killing each other, hotlines and so forth. And now we are 2 decades later, and we have actually built quite a bit of expertise, and we have conducted a huge number of missions to stabilize and then build peace in places that have emerged from conflict. I just want to, just for a second, just for us to get our heads around this, to think about, let's say, Bosnia, right? So Bosnia happened 1993, 1995, Sarajevo under siege, and then we decided to go in after the Dayton Accords, to stabilize Bosnia. Ironically, think about this, 1989, the wall falls. 1995, guess who we marched in, our troops, guess who they marched in with across the River Sava into Bosnia? Any guess? The Russians. The Russians. So history just whoosh, right? It's like incredible, a flash, right? We're in the Cold War, and then we're marching into Bosnia with Russians to stabilize as a peacekeeping force, a peace support force, to stabilize Bosnia. So if you ever think the crystal ball is crystal, it's not so crystal, and you really have to keep reinventing the way that we approach these crises. So we go into Bosnia. So I always try to think about, because this is about complexity. To fight a war is complex. To win a peace, I believe, is inherently more complex, as I've seen it over the last many decades. So you just think about one thing, right? We go into Bosnia, and we're confronted with mass graves. We're told where they are. What do you need to deal with a mass grave? Well, first, you have to secure it. So you need peacekeepers or some kind of police of some kind. Then you have to deal with the evidence, which means that you need people with forensic capabilities. Maybe they come out of our police departments, FBI, et cetera. Right? Then you need people that are able to deal with those forensics. So you got to bring back to some kind of lab somewhere or set up mobile labs. Then you need to start trying to figure out who knows what about what happened there. And that leads you to witnesses. And you have to go into communities, and you have to be able to give those witnesses and those people the comfort that they can come forward. And then you have to protect them. So that required us to insert a special force in the United States called the U.S. Marshal Service. They also protect judges. Because after you find the witnesses, and you secure the evidence, and the witnesses tell you about the perpetrators, eventually you're going to need to build out that justice component. So you're going to need judges, you're going to need court reporters, you're going to need translators, you're going to need prosecutors, you're going to need defense attorneys. And just remember, as we talked about, we were fighting a Cold War. We didn't have that. We didn't have any of that. We didn't have any of that with people that actually had worked together or trained together or had anything to pick up and tell them how to do this. And so we were working on the fly. We were building an airplane as we were flying it. And it wasn't just us. It was the UN. It was many, many, many other international contributors. And you can take any other piece, and this is just Bosnia, but it's illustrative. You can take any other piece of that mission, and you can talk about infrastructure, bridges that were destroyed. Bridges were destroyed. There were no bridges, right? Roads, airports, rails, et cetera. Who does that? Who fixes that stuff? Engineers. From where? Architects, transportation architects. From where? So we had the Department of Transportation in there. So before you knew it, we had Department of Education, we had Department of Labor, we had Department of Commerce, we had Department of Transportation, we had Department of State, we had U.S. Agency for National Development, we had Department of Defense, and we had CIA, we had Department of Justice, and on and on and on and on. Multiplied by dozens, if not scores and scores, of the same kind of folks from Germany, from the UK, from all these other donor nations, from the UN, the UN specialized agencies, and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of non-governmental organizations. And everybody arrives. And we haven't done this very often. So you can see how complex, not just the situation was, but the architecture of having everybody work together. Now, the military, when we talk about fighting a war, for years and years and years, they train, and they train together, and they have doctrine, and they have all of these incredibly wonderful systems that allow them to understand exactly how the logistics guy is going to work with the communications folks, right? We didn't have that. In the aftermath of Rwanda, the non-governmental humanitarian community had the same problem. They were all over, it was chaotic. They were dealing with having to serve millions and millions of people, and they were stepping all over each other, and they didn't have a system either. And so immediately after Rwanda, they started a project called SPHERE. And SPHERE was an attempt to create minimum standards for humanitarian assistance. It's an incredibly unbelievable document. It's being revised right now. And if anybody thinks that humanitarian organizations don't have a system, take a look at Sphere. They created this thing called the Interagency Standing Committee up at the UN, and they operate on a cluster system, okay? Think about clusters, think about circles. I'll take you to this next. So they operate on a cluster system. They have, sanitation, and they have health, and they have water, and they have organizations that are pinned with that responsibility that operate in this cluster system. And then with the Sphere document, they arrived at minimum standards for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And then they have a humanitarian charter that unites all of them. It says, what are they really trying to achieve in that place? Are they trying to just go in and save people? Yes. But are they trying to build host nation capacity to be able to help their people after they leave? Yes. That's part of the humanitarian charter. So here we are. We're in these operations at a rapid pace. We're not, especially in the United States, because we've been fighting a Cold War. We don't know how to win the peace. Everybody's tooling up, trying to figure it out. And we're trying to march down this path. And we recognized at the time that there is a system. The United States military and other militaries around the world have a system. And it's built on lessons. How many of you were in the class this morning? Oh, good, okay. It's built on lessons, right? So we've been conducting these operations. And actually, the UN have been conducting peacekeeping missions since 1960. The first one was in the Congo. So there's lessons. So you mine those lessons. You grab those lessons from the field. Military has an incredible system for doing that. We were trying to play catch up. But there's tons of reports out there. And so you need to have those lessons, and you need to take them on board, and you need to write them down. Because they tend to go home in the pockets, or the notes pads of people who've been out there in the field, and they never, ever get back to institutions, because this field is everybody's just rotating all the time. So you got to take the lessons, and you got to write them down. And then in the military system, they elevate that into doctrine, right? And doctrine gets everybody on the same sheet of paper, same sheet of music, tries to establish a common vocabulary so people can talk to each other. It puts those lessons into a format that people can then agree on that are executable, so they can go out and execute them. Then they train them on it so that everybody understands what it means. And then they go out and assess, right? Now, they might not actually go out and assess, but right now, before the U.S. military went back into Iraq, they did a period of assessment. What's it look like on the ground? What should we be doing? What do we know? How do we respond to it? And right now, all over the world, we have assessment teams, UN, Brits, the multiplicity of actors have assessment teams that are going out to look at the ground, look at Libya, look at Niger, look at Mali. Probably we're going to fire up Burkina Faso in a moment here, because there's problems there today. Looking at Ebola, et cetera, et cetera. And you start with assessment so you can understand what's going on the ground. And then you come back, and ideally, you construct a plan, right? Because you have to decide how you're going to respond, what your priorities are, how you're going to align your personnel and your resources, who your allies are, who are the other people that are going to be on the ground that you're going to be working with, and that's your plan. And then you go out and you execute your plan, but the whole time you're continuing to assess, because a plan I think there's a common saying that your plan is only good as before the time it hits the ground. And then when it hits the ground, you start realizing that things are going to change what happens to your plan. Example, a leader might be assassinated. You might have an outbreak of disease. You might have an earthquake in a place you're trying to stabilize. And that's going to change what you're doing. And so you have to constantly iterate on your plan. And then you have to monitor and evaluate your progress. And this is a growing field. And if I had a kid that was going back to school today, I'd say, monitoring and evaluation is pretty darn important. As I was saying this morning, I just came back from U.S. Africa Command in Stuttgart. It tended to be that you would have inspector generals and special inspector generals looking at you and with a fine-tooth comb after you had been in the field for a while executing. The inspector generals, they're right there. They have taken up residence in US AFRICOM at USAID, and they were looking at every single cent that we're spending on Ebola. So we've learned a lot about the importance of accountability, of following the money, of sticking to your goals and objectives. And so monitoring and evaluation is here to stay with us. And it's really important because you can't change your plan if you're not monitoring and evaluating what you're doing. So this is a cycle, okay? It's a really important cycle. And what happened in the 90s, in the late 90s, I don't know if you've heard of the Brahimi report, but the Brahimi, Lakhdar Brahimi at the UN was asked to look at the UN system, and they started innovating. They created the UN Integrated Mission Planning process. They did a whole host of reforms to their peacekeeping, multidimensional peacekeeping. They created their first doctrine. And so they started marching on that path. The Brits created what was first the post-conflict Reconstruction unit. It's now the Stabilization unit. To me, it's the model that we should all aspire to. Their Ministry of Defense, their Department of, it's called DFID, but it's their International Development Agency like USAID, and their Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is like our Department of State, came together, threw in some money, threw in some people, and created this unit that was going to go out and assess and plan and deploy to conduct these missions and then bring back the lessons and keep retooling. The Germans built a unit. The French built an interministerial unit. The Danes built a stabilization unit. The Japanese built a unit. Everybody started building units. The EU built a civilian response force. NATO built they were very late in the game. They jumped in too, though, and they have something called the CCOMC. But everybody started traveling on that path, and we're still on that path. So let's just talk, because I want to have time for us to all ask some questions and discuss some of this. So let's just look at the United States for a minute. If you think about all of the departments and agencies that I just said were in Bosnia, and that's just a good example of any other place, who organizes them, right? What authorities do they have? Who trains them? Who gives them resources? And so we had to ask ourselves all of those questions. And we started with an inquiry to go out to all these different agencies to actually map what the assets and capabilities were inside the U.S. government across multiple agencies to be able to conduct these kind of operations. And we found a rich array of assets and folks with experience, maybe relatively new experience, and we mapped that. And then we decided to recommend to the NSC, and this was when I was at U.S. Institute of Peace, but the National Security Council staff had encouraged us to do this. We decided to recommend to the NSC that there be a special organization, an office created in the Department of State called the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. You might ask, in the midst of all this, why just an office? Well, we had just in the aftermath of 9/11 created the Director of National Intelligence, Department of Homeland Security, and Congress was not exactly in the mood to create another bureaucracy. In retrospect, it might have been very good to have created some kind of agency for complex overseas contingencies, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But we didn't do it at the time because there wasn't the appetite. So we put this office in the State Department, again, the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. Next to it was also an office on counterterrorism, an office on women's issues, and some of those have now grown up to be bureaus. And the office was charged with three things. One, assessment and planning, right? Interagency, to coordinate the interagency, all these different departments and agencies to do assessment and planning. 3, to create a civilian response force that could go out and deploy. And 4, to make sure that they were trained and ready and able to work across these multiple agencies and with the UN and others. So that's what we attempted to do. But they didn't have any doctrine, right? And they didn't have any lessons. So at USIP, I was told, make them work, make them happen, get them up on steroids, you know, and so that's what we started. And we realized that not only did we not have any lessons or doctrine that was put in one place anywhere, but nobody else did either. And so we went out across the globe to the UN and to the Brits and to NATO and the EU and everyone else, African Union, and we said, would it be helpful for you to have something that told people how to, you know, what we were trying to do in these missions and what our experience was, and write it down all in one place? And they said, absolutely. And so they gave us a dump of all their materials, thousands and thousands of documents. And over a year period, we read all those documents, and we elevated what we thought was common among all of these agencies, what they had been trying to do in these places, into this strategic framework. And at the end of the day, I think what we found, and this is the wonderful part, is everybody had an essential agreement about what we were trying to do. People called it different things, but at the end they agreed. So and we also we really took a lot of our inspiration from the Sphere document and the fact that they had these clusters, but that the clusters were overlapped, because at the end of the day, you know, water and health and food assistance, if you can't do that together and in a synergistic way in a place, you're not going to be able to deliver, you know, have people alive, right? So that's where these concentric circles came from. But at the end of the day, we decided that, or not decided, we found that the consensus was we were really trying to, in these places, at the end of the day, what we were trying to achieve was a safe and secure environment, rule of law, social well-being, and you can look at what's under there, stable governance, and believe it or not, that started out with stable democracy, but people vetted it down to stable governance, and a sustainable economy. Underneath that, we put, there's 22 conditions. So after we found this agreement among people, some people call it justice and reconciliation instead of rule of law. Again, the United States would have preferred to be called stable democracy. The rest of the world wanted it to be governance. So this is a vetted consensual document, okay? But then we asked ourselves, what are the conditions that you need to establish to have a safe and secure environment? So again, we dug into those documents and we elevated what we thought were points of consensus among people who have been doing this for now quite a period of time. We started this in 2008. And just, you know, an example under safe and secure environment, cessation of large-scale violence, public order, legitimate state monopoly over the means of violence, physical security for vulnerable populations, and territorial security for borders, et cetera. Those were the conditions. Underneath that, in each one of these places, we then elevated these practices, lessons, approaches that we have been using over and over again in many of these places that stand the test of time, that we want people to be able to repeat again and again. And then finally, we acknowledge that there are many gaps. And if you're sitting here in school, I would encourage you to take a look at the gaps in this document. And if you go to the British Stabilization Unit website, they offer up a whole bunch more. But there are so many things that, yes, we know how to do them now. You know, you need the political will, you need money and resources. But there are so many things that we don't know how to do. We don't know how to build an accountable, transparent security sector with civilian oversight. We don't know how to teach history after conflict. We don't know how to create systems that allow people to be able to go back into communities where others are living in their homes, of land titling and land reform and land dispute mechanisms. We don't have that. There are many things that we still need to work on. We need to do research. We need to figure out how to do those things. And we need to do those in pretty rapid time, because I promise you we're going to mount a very big operation in Syria at some point. So it's not an academic exercise. It's something that we really, really need. So I'm just going to close just by saying that even as we have done all of this, and it is in use around the world, and there's other people that have many, many other wonderful documents and frameworks that add to our knowledge and our ability to practice, that the ground is shifting under our feet once again. Because just like we talked about, we were really good. We practiced the Cold War. Then we got into this field. Well, now there's another push. And the push is, we're doing this, but we're doing it in places where the rise of violent extremism and the rise of violent extremist organizations that don't know borders, that are transnational, that link up with organized crime and gangs in Central America and export into West Africa. I mean, that is the new challenge for us. So now we know that in most places, if we do a stabilization and peace-building operation, we're going to confront those violent extremist actors. We're going to confront organized crime. We're going to confront bad actors who are going to challenge us in every way, shape, or form. And are we going to be able to effectively deal with them? Do we have the lessons? Do we have the concepts? Do we have the people that are skilled? Do we have the knowledge to be able to deal with that problem? That is before us right now, and it's changing the way that we think about things in Washington in Washington and other places in a very serious way. You guys had in the military Black Hawk Down. Did y'all see the movie? We had Benghazi. And after Benghazi, our folks, civilians, we are very, very hunkered down. The risk posture for us to be able to get out and do our job in these places is, there's no tolerance for risk. So we have to invent a new way of working in these places. And there's just these realities. So we have come a long way. We have built a field. It is a discipline. And there are hundreds and hundreds of institutions who are out there working every day. We have our challenges, and now we have, as history is wants us to do, tells us that we have to keep changing. This violent extremism problem is extremely difficult. And then, and I be quiet, you have Ebola, right? Now, where is Ebola happening? Ebola is happening in a place that has stabilization missions, Sierra Leone and Liberia. And we were doing very well in both of those places. There are peacekeepers in both of those places. What Ebola shows us is that, again, it's not an academic exercise to do this nation-building, state-building, stabilization, peace-building enterprise. Because if we had been able to really build the health systems and governance that is required in a country after they have been through decades of conflict, maybe they'd be able to handle this Ebola crisis. But these are places that have been through unbelievable conflict, and their systems were not ready for prime time. And this is the biggest, certainly the biggest complex situation I've ever been involved in my life. But it is all about all of that. It is all about all of that. It's not just a response to a health emergency. It's about a country being able to withstand the shock of that Ebola crisis on its economy, on its security, on governance, on every single thing. So this is really, really important that, that we get this right. So I look forward to any of your questions or challenge me, or anything. So Floor is open. Yeah.
Well, I find this fascinating. Is it top secret? Because I've never heard of any of it before, and I'm a very careful reader of the newspaper. But further than that, can you get beyond this organizational thing? You keep saying we.
Mm-hmm.
Things go to hell in northern Iraq. You and a large go there. Who go there? Where do they come from? What happened? I mean, there must be some activity occurring. And carrying this in their hand, these people gather from all over the world and go
Right.
to Fallujah?
So it does start in the nation's capitals and at the UN. And sometimes our systems are really good. Right now, we're a little bit dysfunctional. And I can say this, I'm on the record, and I can say it because I think everyone would agree. Partly it's the weight of the crises that we're dealing with. But in Washington, I'll give you an example. My agency has a Syria task force. We've been meeting for 3 years. Working for 3 years. You know, we're feeding 4.2 million people inside Syria, performing surgeries every single day. We've moved trucks across the borders to clean up rubble, school supplies, ambulances, solar generators, flour for bakeries. So we've been doing this for 3 years. We've been doing it. Mm-hmm. We've been doing it with the State Department. We've been doing it with the knowledge of our Department of Defense colleagues. We've been doing it with the agencies that are on the ground in Jordan and in Turkey. So it's a very complex operation. We are doing pieces of stabilization inside Syria in liberated areas and opposition control zones. We are helping them to build governance systems. We have built media. We've built radio stations. We have built websites. None of this is branded. There isn't a USAID brand in the place because this is about the host nation. And it's about the protection of people that are doing this work on the ground. And so, you know, we work together. We bring together all the people that have the different skill sets and funding authorities and money to create a plan that we are executing, multi-agency in the U.S. government. There are interagency policy committees and deputies committees and principals committees and National Security Council sessions on this every week. And that's how we're organizing. And then the UN has its organization and, you know, and others that are working to do the same thing. That's what we do.
The host nation in Syria is Syria.
Well, that is true. But, you know, Syria is a factionalized place. Our government made a decision that they believed that the Assad regime was a threat to its own people and needed to go. And we were charged with helping to build the capabilities of the opposition inside Syria to govern and provide essential services and humanitarian assistance to people living inside those borders. That's what we've done. That's what we've done.
Ma'am, I'm an auditor for the Army, and so.
Oh, geez. I should have been careful. I didn't know.
So in that capacity, I spent some time in Afghanistan, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to some of the lessons learned that you guys have gained from your time in Afghanistan, and maybe speak to how you look to avoid those trip-ups in the future.
I think, you know, it's interesting. If you look back at Afghanistan, we had, in the beginning, we didn't have a lot of money, we didn't have a lot of people, and we didn't have a lot of attention. It was supposed to be a light footprint operation. Everything was going into Iraq. And we were doing really well. If you look at that period, 2001 to 2004, 2005, we were under, you know, no one was really focused on what we were doing, which is a lesson right? Sometimes it's better not to have the focus of the world on you. We were being very successful in building local systems, local governance systems, healthcare systems, building schools, getting people into those schools, textbooks, et cetera, et cetera. Restarting economic growth, building local markets. And then violence started happening at an alarming rate. Some of the first suicide bomber, I think it was 2004, changed the calculus of many. Money started pouring in. There were a lot of people spending a lot of money. There was not we had what we called the lead nation approach in Afghanistan, which was to say, U.S., you're responsible for building the security forces or the military. Italians, you take the justice system. Germans, you take the cops. Japanese, you take, XXX, right? That doesn't work. No one's accountable at the end of the day, and so that didn't work. Money is as corrupting an influence for us as it is, when we like to talk about it on local officials, right? Because you have too much money, you can't spend it fast enough, and and some things don't actually require as much money as you think, because the local solutions are probably cheaper. So you have to find that balance between finding those local solutions and empowering them to be able to take care of their own needs, as opposed to being the interveners who then create a dual economy, a separate system, and it's very codependent. So I think that we learned that from Afghanistan, and I don't think it will ever be repeated again. I really don't. Unless, 3 generations from now we forget. But that's why you got to write it down. So you have to write it down. Yeah.
So that was in reference to the provincial reconstruction teams, right?
No, I think it's a big overall comment about.
Do you have any experience with the provincial reconstruction teams?
I have done at USIP, we did, I think, the definitive lessons, interviewing all the members of the PRTs and the lessons work on the PRTs. So, I mean, I have comments about the PRTs, but.
You hesitated a couple times when you talked about the stable governance versus stable democracy. Could you talk about that in regards to maybe what happened in Egypt and currently in Syria?
Yeah, I think democracy takes a long time. Look at our country. I mean, it took us a really long time, and I don't know, some people would say we don't quite have it right yet, or right now, we don't have it quite right. When this is about stabilization, right, and peace building, so it's about what is necessary for a country emerging from conflict. Do they need an election right away? Because in Bosnia, we just put in place these 3 guys that fought the war, right? And they're still there. And they're ready they'll fight again if they could. So a lot of this democracy is about maturation of systems and processes and people after conflict. New leaders might emerge that you don't even know about. Give them a chance. They might not have political parties, but they might not have a census. They don't have the rules and laws that would enable them to conduct an election. It might be that you have these elections and you have to pour all the resources or majority of the resources that you have into making sure that election comes off and you're able to secure it, et cetera. We've seen it over and over and over again. And the international community was very wise when they looked at this and what they think we wanted to send a message is democracy is it's not that it's not, we don't want to aspire to letting people have a voice. There are other ways to let people early on have a voice through plebiscites and other types of mechanisms without having a full-out, complicated democratic system. But what they do need is governance. They do need people that are going to take the money in, that are going to be accountable for that money, that are going to be able to construct budgets and manage those budgets and make sure that the services are being delivered to people. And that's not necessarily about democracy, that's about governance. So I think that's where that came from.
I have a question regarding the rise of Ebola in West Africa. So some of the analysis I have read has attributed Ebola to the continued prevalence of extractive industries, pushing further and further into the jungle in West Africa, where things like Ebola and Marburg remain latent. So given that assumption, is it possible to say that there's a failure in at least on the macroeconomic stabilization aspect, that local populations have to resort to continued extractive industries?
Yeah, you know, what did they say? Economics is a dismal science? No, I don't know. It's not my sweet spot. I don't focus very much on this, and so I think I would be out of my realm to talk about it in any detail. But if you look at most of the places in the world that have been in conflict where we've done stabilization missions, they have extractive industries. They have minerals, and they have they're resource rich. And so the idea that you can just push that aside and not deal with it, I think is not realistic. And we have spent many, many years trying to perfect the Kimberley process and a lot of other things to make sure that those extractive industries are managed by the government or the industries on behalf of the people, and they're not like South Sudan, just filling the coffers of people who are now waging war in their country. Or going out to the Chinese and other people and not benefiting the population at all. So there's a lot there, and I'm not doing justice to your question, but I can direct you to other people who could do that better. And I don't want to comment on the link between Ebola and extractive industries. I mean, I've heard that as well. I think it's going to take us a while to figure out what really happened with this Ebola transmission. So, yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could comment on if you think that the structure of USAID being a sort of contracting agency is helpful in these environments, or would you prefer if you could sort of redesign it from scratch, a more bureaucratic kind of approach? Or
so I've heard that rap about USAID for many years, and I've been at the agency. I've worked with the agency for many years, but I've only been there for 2.5. And I had that kind of a little bit of a negative, it's just a contracting agency.
No, I didn't mean to say it in a negative way.
I know that, but I did, right? I had a negative, I was inclined to think negatively about USAID being a contracting agency. So, first of all, Congress gutted USAID in the 90s, right? So they took down the staff. And we were unable to build the foreign service that we needed, and we're now rebuilding it, but it was gutted, and so we have junior level officers and we have senior level officers. I believe it's 95% of them can retire today, and so that's a real big problem for the agency. So in response, they built up this other way of doing business. And actually, I think it's been a blessing, because we are able to surge. In the resource-constrained environment that we have in Washington right now, and budgets aren't going to get any bigger, if you try to maintain a staff, a headquarters or field staff of tens of thousands of people, we have under 10,000 people at USAID. That's a heavy bill, right? Instead, we rely on implementing partners, a network of people, and a surge capability through personal service contracts that enable us to be more agile and nimble in response. The State Department tried to replicate that over the last couple of years. The IG didn't quite like that because they said, well, we already have it at USAID. But it's, people aspire to do that. It's like the reserves, we're not going to be able to maintain these standing forces. Now, where I like USAID to be doubled in size, no question. No question. We need more people to do the job that we're being asked to do. But I don't think that we would throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the contracting method, the ability for us to work with a network of providers that are very experienced, is what is enabling us to do the Ebola response right now, and Syria. So I don't think we'd want to walk that back. I think it's okay.
So I have two sort of questions on different areas. The first one is on M&E, and the second one is on CDE, so monitoring and evaluation and countering violent extremism. On the M&E side, so we might be in a project right now with the State Department folks who are trying to replicate what USAID is doing on this contracting thing. So we have a project with the Office of GPI, the Global Partnerships Office, and they're asking us to evaluate this kind of thing. So they're asking us to look at how they built this huge partnership structure for cook stoves, and to figure out how and why state could play such an interesting catalytic role in that. So they don't want us to evaluate the cook stove project, the Global Cook Stove Alliance project. They want us to evaluate their agency in this particular department and how they were able to create this kind of infrastructure. And I mean,
So that's really interesting.
yeah, so I mean, and I'm hearing a lot of what they're asking us to do in terms of some of the comments that you've made. So, I mean, part of me in working on this project and my work in general, I find this, just a fascinating intellectual exercise. Mm-hmm. The idea that you're taking practice-based lessons and putting it out through the, analytical level till you make a doctrine or a theoretical infrastructure, et cetera. I mean, I think this is absolutely essential work. I think that universities, especially policy schools and security schools, should be involved in this kind of thing in a more intimate way, if we can be. I think we need to talk to practitioners more about the kinds of research questions at stake and how we can contribute, or if we can contribute. I just wanted to share that bit on the M&E side. I think this is absolutely essential. And if you have more comments about how to direct us in a useful way there, I would very much love to hear them.
Okay.
And then the CVE thing is just a real simple point. You talked about trying to reinvent the wheel each time for these mission challenges that we're facing, Cold War, post-Bosnia, post-9/11, now with this kind of environment. It seems to me that partly what makes CVE challenging is that it challenges states and governments on each of these sections, right? I mean, we all know how Islamic State is challenging our rule of law, right? It's trying to replace their own kind of iconoclastic interpretation of Sharia law with this, right? We can see how they're challenging on safe and secure environment. I mean, in some ways, they've taken this as their antithetical mission set.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit more about how CVE and the kind of transnational armed forces aspect of that really puts a wrench in the machine.
Okay, so first on the M&E thing, I think that one of the most valuable things that we learned about this, and I teach in an academic institution on the side, is that it's so important to vet.
Okay.
So we didn't just take everybody's documents in, write this thing, and then just publish it. We took it back out in draft to every single person that had given us those documents to begin with, and they were able to do line in, line out comments. And we took those comments, and if we didn't take those comments, we told them why. So and we learned this from the military doctrinal process. I mean, it is the reason that there was a lot of people see themselves in this and recognize it is because they had the ability to shape it. And I think a lot of the academic research that we're given, and I've done academic research before, so I know I've been there, is you get it, and it's very useful, but you don't know, I mean, it's been peer reviewed, right? But you don't know if who's had the ability to look at it and to what I would call vet it. It's not to diminish it at all, but when you're trying to do something like the cook stove thing and evaluate how these people did it, you're going to have to go back to the people that executed it to get their impressions. And then when you write it up and it's done and it stands there as a practice that people maybe could emulate, you're going to want them to be able to have another shot at looking at what you produce before it goes final. I mean, too often, and I'm critical of my own agency here and the Department of Defense, we say that we're exchanging plans and everybody can look at each other's stuff, but actually we give them the cake's baked, we give it to them, we say, oh yeah, we're open to your comments. No, we're not. It's done. It's finished. And so we have to be more open in that draft stage to make the product something that's actually going to be really useful and have legs. I think I really learned, that's a huge lesson I learned about this. I think we have a few more minutes. Yeah.
In one of our classes, we talked about the role of private philanthropy in international development aid. And according to one study, the financing of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation exceeds the budget of the WHO. So if you look at this framework that you provide, I would personally think it would fit best into the social well-being, but it's a fact that they have a huge impact on development aid in many countries. And how do you coordinate your actions with them? Because
Great question.
I think that's a big problem. I experienced the same problem when I worked for the German Ministry for Development Aid, because you talked about doing all those plans and then you talk to other countries and their development agencies, and then you would try to implement it, and then you would suddenly see, okay, there's this private actor doing this since 5 months, and we have to change our plans now.
Well, don't hold me to the statistic because it's just, I'm going to round it a bit. But 25 years ago, 90% of development aid was official government money and 10% or less was private sector or philanthropies. That is flipped. So now less than 10% of development aid worldwide is official government money. And now 90% is the private sector or nonprofit sector. And so what we've done, and I'm very proud of USAID for doing this, USAID has created in July, it's called the US Global Development Lab. And the lab is built on public-private partnerships. So to leverage all of those different actors out there, because we know we're not the driver. We're not in the driving seat anymore. And so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, universities, private corporations, Microsoft, MasterCard, you name it, we're out there working with them. We just put out a challenge, we call these grand challenges for development. We put out a challenge 2 weeks ago for new personal protective equipment. It's called PPEs. It's the stuff that you see, the big zoot suits that you see for Ebola. And it's been remarkably successful. We think we have some new prototypes that are going to be coming out and getting there, because the suits that we have, they're not working. They're too big, too heavy, too restrictive. People can't work in them. They take them off and they spread the stuff, exactly. So it's an emergency, it's an imperative that we try to figure out how to do this, bring it to scale, and also change the way that we're outfitting people. And that is leveraging the private sector, philanthropy, everyone else. It's not going to be us. So that's a really, really important point. U.S. Global Development Lab. It was set up by, the president authorized it in July. And it's called Powered by USAID. I'm not quite sure what that means. So I think we're fueling it, but it's slightly independent. But that's exactly its mission. Yeah.
I was curious, a lot of this framework here is post-conflict. And I was wondering what kind of efforts maybe you've seen successful programs in preventing harm?
Yeah, so my colleagues at USIP, they try to do a prevention framework, and it ended up looking very similar to this. It's just, and then when they found out all the work that went behind it, you know, so they produced a framework, but then I was like, well, actually, guys, you have to go then produce the manual behind the nice little graph.
You can't just take the chart.
Right. They're like, oh, no, we can't do that. But if you just think about any one of these, you can flip it into a prevention lens.
Is there a particular program, I guess is what I'm asking, that you've seen that you've been proud of or feel is hitting its target?
Prevention,
Well, just in...
to me,
Yeah.
prevention for conflict is about development that is conflict sensitive. And so what I would say is increasingly USAID and DFID and other development agencies that are working in unstable, fragile states are applying a conflict-sensitive development lens to what they're doing. And that is the way that you have to do this. And I would say right now, Nigeria is a big test case. We're all trying to figure out, there's a big election happening. They say if Nigeria, you know, sneezes, that the rest of the continent gets a cold. And we don't want that place to rip apart, and they already have challenges from Boko Haram. So we are trying to really apply a very conflict-sensitive approach to preventing conflict in Nigeria. So that's one example. We're not, people talk about conflict prevention all the time, but increasingly conflict prevention is just mainstreamed in all the other things that we're trying to do. You know, in the Department of Defense, they're trying to build security forces and ministries of defense in places that are actually going to not go out and kill people, you know, and so they're building the capacity to build defense institutions that have a development sensitive lens to it. So we're all learning. I think that's a hard lesson, but we've learned that. But it's important. Prevention's important, then we don't have to do the other stuff. So.
Well, I think we're going on, but we actually have to let our speaker have some lunch because we've been exploiting her for a while today.
No, it's been great. No, this is great. Thank you. Thank you so much.